Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are going to go ahead and get started with a little bit of an introduction as folks continue to trickle in. And yeah, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're calling in from, and we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our deep dive webinar on connecting the dots between grid investments and energy affordability. We can go to the next slide, bit of an introduction. So if this is your first time, my name is Kristen Suarez, my pronouns are she, they. I am the State Climate Policy Network Manager here at Climate Exchange. I will go ahead and send a link to our website in the chat if you're interested. If it's your first time, climate-exchange.org/network. And on the next slide, just a bit of background on Climate Exchange. We're a national organization focused on passing effective and equitable climate policy at the state level. The SCPN is one of our main national programs for supporting state work. We're a network of over 15,000 advocates, legislators, researchers, government officials, basically all sorts of folks working in and around state-level climate policy across all 50 states. We put on virtual events to convene experts and advocates. We also provide policy assistance and policy tracking services. Overall, with the network, my motto is someone somewhere has done what you're trying to do. And so we try to connect you to the experts and the resources who will help supercharge your campaigns and really leverage the lessons learned and the vast experience of state climate policy advocates across the country. And so I will send my email in the chat if you want to reach out to me to learn more about what we do or how we can support your work. Feel free. That's Kristen@climate-exchange.org. And we can go to the next slide. Last plug, so we can support you and your work, or we can connect you to someone who can. We specialize in tracking and analyzing state climate policy. We're climate generalists, so across all sorts of mitigation sectors. And we also specialize in providing connections to experts, advocates, tools, resources, folks working on similar issues to you. And we can provide example states for certain climate policies, state landscape analyses, things like that. We also host a state climate policy dashboard on our website. That's climatepolicydashboard.org, where you can sort, filter, and compare over 60 different types of climate policies across all 50 states. So we can go ahead and get into our event today. On the next slide, we have a great couple of speakers today to talk about grid investments and energy affordability. And before I get into an introduction of our speakers, just a quick logistical note. Feel free to use the chat box as a space for connection, sharing resources. But if you have any topic-related questions for the panelists, you can submit those at any time through the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. If you send those to the chat, they might get lost. This webinar is also being recorded, so if you have to hop off early or you knew someone who wanted to make it but can't, that's totally fine. We'll be sending the recording, slides, and a brief recap article via email by the end of the week. So we can get into the discussion. Today we're looking at how grid investments relate to energy affordability and how to talk and communicate about those things. Energy affordability is obviously a top priority for many states right now. And the level of investment that's needed to build out a reliable, resilient, and really well-planned grid, especially when it comes to transmission, is high. But it is what's needed to secure the most affordable and reliable energy in the years to come. So we've invited a couple of experts to help you all work through these issues. First, we have Zach Zimmerman from Grid Strategies, who will present on their recently released report looking into how exactly transmission investments save costs for consumers. And then we'll hand it over to Abby Watson from the Groundwire Group to share best practices and lessons learned on how to approach messaging and communication around the topic of energy affordability when talking about large grid investments like these. So hopefully this gives you all some insights in just this kind of power hour. But I will go ahead and we can go to the next slide. And we'll hand it over to Zach Zimmerman, who's the Research and Policy Manager for Grid Strategies, focused on economic and regulatory analysis related to power markets and transmission. So I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Zach. Thanks so much for being here, and we can go to the next slide.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you to Climate Exchange for having me here today. As Kristen said, I am a research and policy manager at Grid Strategies, and we work on transmission across the board. And so we worked on this report with some of my colleagues, Michael Goggin, Rob Granick, and Gretchen Kershaw, um, as a part of a report for Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, or ASEG, which is another group focused on advocacy around large-scale transmission development. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So I'll just give a brief overview of kind of the framing for this report and what the report covers. And then I'm also very glad that Abby's here today to talk about some of the messaging. Our report at a high level covers the real benefits and ratepayer impacts that large scale transmission can have, but doesn't necessarily dive into how do you take those results and turn it into a compelling message for folks. So I think this is a great two-part series today. So as I said, the impetus for this report, as Kristen kind of touched on, is the fact that we need to double or triple the amount of transmission capacity that we have currently today. And unfortunately, we are not building out transmission at the rate to meet those goals. We just released another report yesterday showing that we are well behind the rate of transmission build out that's required to meet our transmission goals and decarbonize the power sector. So the other part of that is that load growth is kind of accelerating all of these issues. I'm sure you all have seen the reports of the huge amounts of new load growth that's coming from pretty critical sectors, I think, for the US in terms of data centers and AI, but also some advanced manufacturing like semiconductors and electric vehicle battery manufacturing. So there's some big industries that are going to need to be supported through the power grid and have power supplied to them. And so that is accelerating the need for some of this big transmission build out. The other piece of this report is that there's increasingly concerns around rising utility bills. And I think there was some surveys that came out this spring that 3 in 4 Americans are concerned about the increasing costs on their utility bills. And so part of this report was just trying to address some of the misconceptions around transmission and its costs, and to also provide some bottom-up analysis of real transmission plans and deployed transmission around the country to demonstrate that there are meaningful savings for consumers on their electric bills. So I think with that, we can jump in. If you want to go to the next slide, we'll start off with one of the first misconceptions. I think one of the things that we hear about when talking to folks about new transmission investments is that it only benefits certain generation technologies, or that it only benefits certain types of customers. We repeatedly reinforce that transmission is resource and technology agnostic. So once once a power plant produces electricity and it's put onto the grid, that the grid simply transports it to where it needs to go. And the facts on the ground right now are that most of the electricity we generate today comes from natural gas and coal. I think a lot of us would like to see that transition, but it is just a reality to talk about when you're having conversations with folks about transmission and how it may only support renewable energy. The other thing that I'll note is that transmission facilitates a lot of benefits that I'll get into in the future. It helps to deliver the lowest cost power while increasing reliability for consumers. And so whenever transmission is built, there are some of those benefits that accrue to all consumers across the board. So I think this is most frequently comes into play when we're talking about things like new large loads coming online. There are transmission lines that are specifically needed for large loads, but many of those lines, when they're added, also provide additional economic and reliability benefits to consumers. And planning for those lines in a organized and well-planned, proactive fashion is the way to deliver the lowest cost overall system. With that, I think we can go to the next slide. The other thing that we also often hear about is that transmission has a higher upfront price tag, and that will lead to some costs that you see on your transmission bill or on your electric utility bill. Uh, and we'll see that a little bit on the final slide that I'll talk about some of the savings that we see. But this is just to note that um, investing in transmission does have costs that we all end up paying for. However, transmission is only around 14% of residential electric bills today for the average US household. So while there may be some increase in the overall transmission component of your bill, that increase is much smaller than the overall savings that are realized from decreasing the generation component of your bill, which is about 60% on average. So this is kind of represented by this graph here from MISO. MISO is the mid-continent grid operator. My boss likes to call it the operator for the Big Ten schools. Um, though I guess that doesn't count now that some of the California and West Coast schools have joined the Big Ten. But generally, it's Midwest states, and they basically have done several studies that show optimizing the build out of transmission and generation lowers overall total system costs for consumers. And you can kind of see that sweet spot in the middle. And this is thinking about building large scale transmission to reach kind of that regional generation, which is on the right. That's generation that's further away from where people are using electricity versus the local generation, which is building things like much closer to load centers, but requires less transmission. And there's this kind of sweet spot in the middle where if you're optimizing the build out of transmission and a good combination of resources closer to where people are using electricity versus resources that are further away, you get this lower overall system costs. So this is when you hear about people talking about proactive transmission planning and well-planned transmission, this is kind of what they have in mind, is optimizing this build out of transmission and generation. So those are some of the misconceptions. We'll now jump to what are the benefits that transmission provides. The biggest one is that transmission provides significant economies of scale, particularly as you go up in voltage. So 765 kV lines, which are some of the highest voltage lines that are built in the US today, those deliver the biggest economies of scale. You can get 70% of savings for consumers over the lifetime of investment from using these bigger lines. And we're starting to see them be planned in, again, places like the Midwest, in Texas, and also the SPP, or like Plains states, are building 765 kV. And I think there are a couple lines also going in the Mid-Atlantic PJM region. Some of the benefits, ERCOT recently approved, or Texas recently approved, a large transmission plan, about $30 billion total investment. And what they found was that they kind of laid out two plans. One was using 765 kV lines, and the other was using 345 kV. And kV stands for kilovolt, and it's the voltage that runs over the line. I think I should have said that. But basically what they found is that across any category you looked at, the 765 kilovolt lines provided much greater savings and also reliability. Approximately $220 million in annual reduction in energy costs, and then almost 900 million in reduced construction related outage costs. So this is something that people don't necessarily think about, but there's actually less lines overall that are needed when you have a 765 kV line, because they transmit significantly more power than the smaller lines. And so you actually need less of the lines overall in comparison. And so you reduce the outages in the construction time period. So there's a lot of economies of scale that come from these higher voltage lines. Next slide. Another significant benefit that comes from building out large scale transmission is reduction in congestion costs. So congestion is simply the congestion. What it means is that the lowest cost energy is unable to be delivered to folks who are trying to use electricity. And so it requires more expensive electricity to be dispatched in order to meet that demand. And so building out this larger scale transmission can reduce those congestion costs. We estimated in a previous report that in 2023, there was almost $12 billion in congestion across the United States. from limited transmission capacity. So building out transmission would help to reduce some of those costs. As an example, in the New England states, the grid operator there built out some significant high voltage transmission backbone projects in the early 2000s, and saw their annual congestion costs reduced from about 700 million annually to now about 100 million over the past decade. So that's about $600 million in savings annually from those investments. Next slide, please. The other thing that building out transmission does is it allows you to share amongst your neighbors. So increasing connections amongst neighbors helps to reduce what's known as planning reserve margins. So this is the electricity that grid planners plan for in extreme situations where the grid is highly stressed. So often these can be extreme winter storms or heat waves, things of that nature. You want to make sure that you have enough power in reserve to meet a potential high demand scenario. And what we find is that those periods where the demand peaks or is highest amongst regions, they're not the same time period, which means that as you are able to share electricity between regions, you actually reduce the overall reserve margin that needs to be planned for. So you reduce the generation investments. This is often one of the big benefits that you'll hear when talking about interregional transmission. But it essentially means that regions are able to access their neighbors' generation during times of stress, and it reduces what they need to kind of hold in reserve. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the other thing that it does. While it reduces reserve margins, it also reduces price spikes during extreme weather events. So if you look at this map here, this map shows interregional transmission connections between different regions in the US. And this is from a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab report, where they essentially found that there is a lot of value in transmission lines that comes from a small number of hours. This means that interregional transmission is helping to essentially prevent price spikes and allowing power to be shared, potentially even preventing blackouts or power loss during extreme weather events. They found that 50% of the value from a typical transmission line accrues in just 10% of the hours over the course of the year. So this means that this interregional transmission has significant reliability, but also ability to prevent like rate shocks during extreme weather events that we can see across the country. Next slide. Okay, so now we covered some of the misconceptions, and we also talked about some of the key benefits that transmission provides. I'll now dive a little bit into our analysis and just talk about what we found. For our analysis, we covered, let's see, I believe it was 16 transmission studies or plans that had been developed across the country. So there are some plans from the New England states, New York, Southwest Power Pool, which is the Plain States, Texas, the Southeast, and then also MISO in the Midwest. So based on the benefit cost analysis that were developed for those plans, we were then able to extrapolate a national estimate of the savings that transmission could provide consumers if that rate of transmission build was kind of applied across the US. So what our analysis found is that extrapolating the current rate of transmission build across the US could save consumers on net $6.3 to $10.4 billion annually. And that's after accounting for the cost of the transmission build. So this roughly translates to, for every $1 million that's invested in transmission, consumers could save between $3.80 and $4.70. It could see $4.70 in savings. The other thing to note is that while we were doing this, some of the initial estimates of benefits were underestimates. So after the lines were built and planners went back and kind of reassessed the benefits that those transmission plans had for consumers, they often found that the benefits were 20 to 40% higher than initially projected. So this could mean that savings for consumers across the US could be as high as $14 billion annually. Next slide, please. So I apologize for the formatting there, but what does this mean for individual households? Translating those billion-dollar costs into ratepayer savings, we do find that there are real savings on the monthly electric bill. We estimate that just given the current rate of transmission build out, households can see savings between $44 and $73 annually. However, we do one case study for MISO. MISO, the Midwest grid operator, has been planning out high voltage transmission at a much higher rate than the rest of the country. And if you just look at the MISO region and the savings that those transmission lines are accruing for its ratepayers, you could see savings rise as high as $200 for MISO. And that's something that could be extrapolated to the rest of the country if everyone else built at a similar rate. So annual savings could be quite high from transmission. And the other thing to note is that these transmission projects provide the savings over the lifetime of a project. So most planners think about transmission lines having a lifespan of about 50 years. So when you extrapolate out $200 of savings over 50 years, it's a pretty significant amount of benefits. And then the other last thing I wanted to note is just that to the generation versus transmission cost breakdown. So how do these savings actually break out on your bill? In general, you would save about $92 per year on the generation portion of your bill, and you would see probably the transmission portion of your bill rise about $19 per year. So that's just going back to that original point where investments in transmission do cost money, and it's something that we all pay for, but the savings that we accrue from those investments is much larger in the long run. With that, I think I'll end there and take any questions that we might have.
Yeah, thanks
Thank you.
so much. I think some of the questions maybe we'll ask toward the end because I think they're a little more relevant to maybe both of you. But yeah, feel free to take a look at what some of the folks are asking in the Q&A, and if you want to type those answers, you can. But we'll definitely get to them at the end. But thank you so much, Zach. That was a lot of great information. Also, feel free to send a link to the report in the chat so folks can see that as well. But yeah, we will move right along. So now we've seen how does transmission investments, how do these really large grid investments save money? And now we're going to hand it over to Abby Watson from the Groundwire Group to talk a little bit about how to message around that, how to communicate. Abby is co-founder and president of the Groundwire Group, a boutique strategic consulting firm focused on creating a sustainable future and building the stories and strategies that shape our climate future. And Abby's a renewable energy veteran with nearly 20 years experience and has worked across multiple technologies in a wide variety of roles. So I will hand it over to you, Abby. Thank you so much for being here, and we can go on to the next slide.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And Zach, thanks for teeing up this section so effectively, because I think you gave us a lot of great material to work with. But hi, everyone. I am really pleased to be here today to bring some tactical, tangible, skills building type content to a conversation that can sometimes get a little academic with all of the important research and studies that we do. And having the facts and analysis at hand is super important. We have to make sure that the stories that we're telling are true, but they aren't the story. So we've been doing a lot of work with advocacy and trade organizations focused on transmission planning and investment. And the biggest gap that we're seeing is in the sort of broader strategy of public communications. And, it kind of makes sense. Transmission and energy markets are super complicated. There's a lot of layers of regulatory agencies. There's a ton of process. And so for people who spend all their time in this space, it's almost inconceivable that these are topics that we can or should bring into a public dialogue. But we're going to talk about how and why we should do exactly that. So, Bryn, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. As we all know, energy affordability and cost of living are really weighing on people's pocketbooks, and it's generating a lot of pushback to some of the major energy investments that we need to make, like new transmission lines. But the problem is that the energy status quo that's contributing to our affordability challenges are solved through investment in modernizing our energy infrastructure. And that's a really difficult message to deliver in this environment. So, we're going to walk through a couple of strategies that anybody from local advocates to state legislators can use when they're talking about energy affordability with folks who don't spend a lot of their time thinking about our energy system. Zach did a great job of showing us how transmission helps to save ratepayers money. But what you'll see in some of our slides is that a lot of our suggested messaging focuses on the age and fragility of the grid that we have, because emphasizing the sort of required nature of ongoing investment that we have to continue to make just to meet our reliability needs, let alone unlocking any of the other benefits that Zach outlined, that's a really helpful starting point for a conversation about making investments, because then you're sort of underscoring the fact that we don't actually have a choice to spend no money on the grid, right? The average age of a large energy transformer in the US is 38 years old. So we'll talk a little bit about how to kind of center that aspect of transmission investment into a conversation about, okay, well, if we have to invest something, what would you rather invest in? So, we really can't just leave it at whether we should. It's really more about what's actually worthy of investment. Bryn, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we have always shared information with each other by telling stories. It's one of the most human traits about us all, and it actually activates different parts of your brain that aren't activated when someone's just delivering, a recitation of facts or ideas. Telling a story is different. And you can use a story or an analogy to help bring another person closer to a concept that you're trying to explain. Relating a complicated issue to something that people are familiar with, it helps put them into that scenario and helps them start listening in a different way, because it really creates empathy. So now they're able to kind of imagine themselves in the decision-making role. So here's a little story I've been playing around with that's pretty simple and more or less universal. I think just about anybody could relate to it. And in my case, it is a true story. It's my own story. But you could very easily use this story and say, someone I know, or this reminds me of a story I heard. So the story goes a little something like this. If someone were to say to me, oh, we should stop making big investments on a transmission line or a clean energy project, I might say, something happened with my car recently, and the whole situation reminded me a lot of what's going on with our power grid right now. I had this car for forever and I just loved it. I had it for ages. It was paid off a long time ago. I loved driving it as much as I loved not having a car payment every month, especially once the price of everything else started going up. And so it got to the point where, it's getting kind of old and there might be a fairly big repair bill every couple of years, but it was still pretty reliable. And it still kind of felt like it was cheaper than buying a new one until this year. And this year we decided to make a really expensive repair on the AC system. And right after that, it needed new brakes at inspection. And then a few days after that, I found out that the sunroof was leaking. And so, that was the last straw. I reached the point where I had to decide it was crazy to keep pouring money into such an old car. And unfortunately, in the 3 years that I had been actively putting off buying a new car, prices went way up, and so did interest rates. And so the whole thing is going to cost me probably a lot more than it would have if I had just bought a new car 3 years ago. The power grid is kind of in the same situation right now. So the grid that we have was built and paid for a long time ago, but now it's kind of falling apart and it's not really able to keep up with all this new demand or to use some of the new technology options that we have. Like my car stereo stopped recognizing my phone in like 2016. And I can't tell you how exciting it was when I was able to plug it into the CarPlay for the first time and really experience what all of this new technology can bring us. So to me, the question is more about, if we have to make an investment in something new, which we've got to do just to keep the lights on, wouldn't you rather invest in the latest technology instead of doubling down on the old stuff? Bryn, can you go to the next slide, please? So, that was one example of a story, and you can kind of riff on a lot of similar stories. There's a couple of rhetorical devices that you can use to kind of make it easy to remember and help shift you away from like a fact delivery mode and more into kind of a relational stance in the conversation that you're having. So you can start with have you ever? Have you ever questions really put the listener into the situation. So have you ever put off making a big investment because you wanted to save money only to end up spending more in the long run? I feel like literally everyone could say yes to that question. You can tee up an analogy by saying it's a lot like. So we don't think much about our power grid, but it's a lot like the state of our roads and bridges. We've put off major investments for years and now it's in rough shape. Okay, so roads and bridges, everyone who drives in the US knows what that's like. They'll know exactly what you're talking about. And then you can go to a would you rather. That really makes the person a decision maker. If we have to invest in replacing and upgrading our systems, would you rather invest in the latest technology or double down on old technology? A note that's I think worth pointing out on language with some of these conversations. So you've probably heard me use the terms power grid and power lines in this session. And we've found that more often than not, if you say transmission line to a person outside the sector, most people have no idea what you are talking about. So mirroring the language that people use and recognize helps kind of close that trust gap. So if the people that you're talking to call them power lines or call them windmills, just roll with it, If you end up in the situation where you have to get in the weeds on different kinds of power lines, that just means that you've successfully engaged them in an ongoing conversation and now they're ready for more detail. But, start out just by calling it the power grid or power lines and people are going to know what you mean. Bryn, can you go to the next slide, please? So this is way more text than I would normally put on a slide during a presentation, but I know that these slides will be shared and that this might be a helpful resource. But basically what this is just like a handful of counterpoints to very common objections that we see on energy investments generally. It's really helpful to have counterpoints kind of in your back pocket, but they are most effective if they find a way to kind of connect or deliver emotion. So you'll see that each one of these counterpoints has like this closer that almost any listener can hear and think to themselves, oh, well, yeah, that's true. And it kind of feels good to think about that, So like when we're talking about our energy bills are too high, we shouldn't be talking about making big investments. Well, it's these small and effective projects that we do piecemeal that drive a lot of our bill increases. Big projects, they might come with big numbers, but they're a lot more cost effective and they get paid off over time. And you know what? Our grid can do amazing things with the latest technology, including save us money. Well, that's something I feel good about as a consumer, thinking about, you're right, technology has come so far, it should be able to help me save money, but we're probably going to need the new technology to do that. If you think about, oh, well, we shouldn't invest in power lines if we don't know that the power generation will materialize. So this is a talking point that is emerging a lot right now in the space for offshore wind transmission investment, where offshore wind projects are having kind of a new degree of uncertainty. But the reality is, any energy project that takes more than 1 or 2 years to develop is going to be exposed to all kinds of risks. We can make our best guesses now, knowing that once a transmission line gets built, it doesn't go unutilized because electricity is really the driver of our modern economy. We have this entrepreneurial DNA as Americans that like someone is going to find a way to use that incredibly valuable piece of infrastructure that we've invested in. And then going to, this idea that renewable energy resources are too expensive, or getting them built takes too long. You can kind of turn that back onto, yeah, it does take too long to build them because it takes too long to build everything in this country right now. Like ask a housing developer or a commercial real estate developer how easy it is to build something. Other types of electricity production have the exact same challenges, the interest, the, inflation, supply chain. But renewable energy stabilizes prices once it's built. It takes out a lot of that volatility from your energy bill. And when you pair them with storage, they can even help us get through periods of shortage, just like how some people are starting to use their EVs as emergency generators when the power goes out. And this is actually something that I see happening that really creates an interesting unification of purpose on this topic among a more, traditionally conservative subset of voters who, are buying their Ford electric F-150s and using them to, back up their houses after a power outage. Bryn, could you please go to the next slide? So I think the key message that I want to leave you all with today is that we don't need detailed polling to help us figure out the right story to tell. We just have to engage in a more authentic and tangible dialogue, and that begins with storytelling. So we have to connect these abstract issues to more shared human experiences. And when we do that, both parties are able to walk away taking a lot more out of that exchange. So as we discussed, analogies are a great way to do that, a great way to find common ground, shared understanding. And the nice thing about an analogy is that it also helps to kind of keep us away from relying too much on data to tell the story. And then, if you can connect an investment in modernizing our energy systems to a more exciting, hopeful, safe, resilient kind of future, like that's a winning message for the general public. I think the Venn diagram of regular folks of all types of voting persuasions who can buy into that kind of vision is probably a lot bigger than most of us think. Okay, Bryn, can you go to the final slide, please? Thank you. So I promised at the beginning of my bit here that I would kind of make the case for why it's so important for policymakers and advocates to bring messages like these to their constituents and to, regular folks outside the sector. You all can be some of our most powerful messengers and really serve an essential role in helping to build a more durable cultural attitude toward how we invest in and value our energy system, because electricity is not only the most indispensable input in our modern economy, it also secures our borders, it keeps our citizens healthy, and it connects us globally. And the state of affairs for our electricity grid, and that's frankly the dire prospects that we're facing over the next 5 years, if we don't really figure out how to break this logjam of political attacks and inaction, like this is the most important conversation that we could be having right now. So I really hope that some of these ideas and tools might help you all kind of go out and carry that torch in your own work. And with that, I'll pass it back to the team at Climate Exchange, and I'm sure there's lots of great questions for us in the chat.
Thank you so much, Abby. And yeah, we can go ahead and stop screen sharing and open the floor for about 20 minutes of Q&A. I really appreciate the both of you being here. I think there's a lot of importance to, of course, have the data and the facts. But a lot of times what we're battling is not data or fact-based, right? So I think it's really important to have both sides. And of course, a lot of this is regional specific. A lot of this is local specific. There's no silver bullet that everyone should talk about the same things or everyone should use the average cost savings nationally, but it's a good place to start in terms of a framework of how to make it local. Only you can make it local, right? Okay, we have a lot of great questions. I'm going to start with a sort of hodgepodge question of a couple things that people have been asking about that generally revolves around comparing grid build out when you're investing in large scale transmission lines to savings from the development of independent grid-free resources, distributed energy resources, CCA programs, things like this. Can you talk to or compare and contrast the kind of savings you see from large-scale transmission build-out as opposed to really fleshing out distributed, things on the distribution side?
I can take that, Abby, unless you want to, or feel free to jump in and add to anything that I missed. What I would say to that question around, distributed energy resources versus the larger grid is the answer is we're going to need both. If you really want to, decarbonize the power sector and also our economy in a meaningful time period to address climate change, we're going to need to do all of those things as quickly as we can. The other reality is that some combination of both resources is going to be the lowest cost system overall for consumers. That goes back to the graph I showed on one of the slides where you kind of have that smile curve. And at the bottom of the smile curve is kind of this balance between distributed resources and large scale transmission. There's a couple reasons for that. The first is right now, distributed energy resources are just more expensive than grid scale resources. So it's going to be a higher cost system if we only do distributed energy resource only type grid. It's also going to be a less reliable system. Distributed energy resources by nature constrain your resource availability to what's close to you geographically. And we just know based on weather patterns that there's periods, long periods where the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And so to reliably address those periods, you either need to significantly overbuild the amount of distributed energy resources that you have, or significantly overbuild the amount of batteries that you're going to add to that system, or you can connect using transmission to access power that's outside kind of your localized weather patterns. And so I think the reality is that you're going to have some combination of both. And I also think that's just the fastest way to do it. Distributed energy resources are going to displace, some transmission lines, and some transmission lines are also going to displace some distributed energy resources. But that's just kind of the reality of that optimizing of both transmission and generation assets that we talked about.
Yeah, maybe the only thing I would add to that is I think from a messaging standpoint, there is no perfect solution, right? You can't rely on only one or only the other. But I do think it's really important as we are talking about, electrifying more elements of people's homes and things like that. Thinking about the role that distributed energy can have at like sort of the individual resilience level. If we have electrified everything in a person's home and then they lose their electricity for a few weeks, then, that's obviously a challenge. So I think we need to be thoughtful about recognizing that having some of that distributed energy gives you a sense of security, and it is a limited sense of security, kind of in the same way that being part of a bigger network is a limited sense of security. Like they're both going to have their limitations, and I think, like Zach said, the right balance in the future system is to probably have both, just from a resilient standpoint.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Definitely, this is a transmission-focused event. Distribution is important. And yeah, no one's saying that it's not important. It definitely is. And I also know that, in terms of the resilience piece of this, I know there's some conversation about DERs versus transmission, especially when it comes to reliability and resilience. There's been some really great work looking into a lot of natural disasters that have happened and what transmission investments would have done if they were operational. If you're looking into Winter Storm Uri, there's a lot of things that transmission investments can serve in those sorts of natural disasters, which are more frequent and intense every year. And there's those sorts of things where you don't realize until it's the emergency that's happening and you don't have power for 5 days a week. And the costs that are lost there are immense, are not included in all of our kind of immediate talking points about the everyday savings to the consumer. So I think it's important to think about those large scale issues. If Texas were connected to the Southeast or were connected to other places during those storms, those rolling blackouts may not have happened, and that's not something that necessarily distribution alone can solve, even in terms of, then we think about microgrids, we think about all those things. But yeah, just a note there. There's been some great reports looking back at disasters that have happened and how transmission could have supported. Yeah.
There's a little bit of an analogy that just came to me, actually, to kind of relate this question to something else. It reminds me a little bit of like your data storage. So now most of us save everything on the cloud, right? Because it's stored in multiple devices. And if one, situation or disaster were to take out the data center where I have saved my file, well, it's actually also saved it, the way the cloud works, right? It's sort of the concept and idea of interconnecting all of these different storage resources so that you can have access to the things that you need at all times. And the transmission system is kind of the same way. So like, it's almost as though if Texas had more interconnections to its neighbors, if it was part of the cloud, rather than being, a server in a warehouse where you've saved your life's work novel, and it's only on that server in that warehouse versus if it's on the cloud. Like, that's to me the sort of difference, the resilience difference that you get out of having like a lot more interconnections and neighbors that you can rely upon to kind of borrow resources and share, versus if you are this sort of like isolated island where, these types of natural disasters have a much more severe impact.
Thank you for that. I am a big pro metaphor person, especially when we're talking about transmission. I mean, I talk to state legislators that don't know what transmission is even. It's just really metaphors and analogies are, I think, really helpful for a lot of different stakeholders. But okay, great. A lot more questions. So question here about estimated transmission savings for ratepayers. Do those change at all when talking about regions with an RTO versus regions without an RTO or without a centralized planning body? And I know that that's in different stages across the country. So yeah, just questions there on transmission savings when it comes to RTO versus non-RTO or non-ISO regions.
I apologize. Could you repeat the question? I was
Sure,
looking
yeah,
at the
no worries, no
Q&A in
worries.
the chat.
Do estimated transmission savings for ratepayers change at all when talking about regions with an RTO or an ISO versus regions without an official centralized planning body?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't get into a lot of the regional results that show kind of some of the more individualized costs for specific regions. It is going to look different in each state just because each state has a slightly different regulatory context in how their utilities are regulated and how that translates to the actual utility bill costs. So our report is aimed a large portion at some of the high level discussion around what can transmission um, what are the savings that transmission can provide, and then it's not necessarily like a one-to-one for an individual state just because of some of the differences that can accrue. I'll also just note that some of the impacts can be as simple as the resource mix that you have in your state, or the like availability of renewable resources. A lot of the savings from large transmission lines come from accessing lower cost generation. And so there are some states that naturally just have better wind and solar resources. And so they're actually probably going to see larger savings than what we showed in our report, just because they have better access to those resources. That doesn't mean that other states can't access that through things like interregional transmission, but just to say that how this translates to individual states will vary.
Great, thank you. Question here on grid reliability. So question asker says, I found in my communication work that grid reliability is very intangible for people as a term. It only really seems to work after power outages or storms. Can you give an example of how to make it a little more real for people when talking about grid reliability? In terms of, question asker says, I don't think people really think about flipping the switch as connected to transmission. So thoughts there.
So absolutely, I think in general that is true. I will say over the last year, maybe 2 years, we are starting to see a lot more news in the mainstream media about, when we have these really extreme heat events or cold events, that the local grid operator is issuing conservation alerts to, residents to help save energy because they're worried they won't have enough electricity. So I do think that this is a topic that is growing in terms of the public consciousness. There's still a long way to go, and I think part of it is that most people genuinely don't realize how old and busted the grid is. Like, this is why I like to use the roads and bridges analogy, because people see that, and especially if they've visited other countries that tend to do a much better job with their road infrastructure, they also know what could be. And so like kind of relating it also gives you a visual. It's sort of, we don't really look at transmission lines a lot, and it's hard to tell by looking at it whether it's old. So if you can kind of imagine in your head, oh, it's sort of like that road or that bridge that I drive over every day that clearly needs a lot more maintenance, I think that's a good entry point to help people understand, oh, well, if it's that old and fragile, like, is that going to make my power go out more often? Like, is there a bigger risk that just hasn't, like, we haven't had the big one yet, So I do think that it is a little intangible. I think things are starting to shift with that because there is a little bit more general discourse about concerns about whether we have enough electricity and whether we're going to be able to keep the lights on.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it. Another question here. In your experience, both of your experiences, who needs the most convincing as to the efficacy of investing in our energy system? Is it consumers, providers, other stakeholders? I'll say from my end, I think it's a lot of people. But I will hand it over to you all for thoughts on who needs the most convincing, whether that's who is most against it or who has the most power as decision makers. I think both of those are different aspects of the question, but yeah.
I guess my opinion is that it's probably the general public because a lot of this kind of flows from there. I think that there are policymakers and decision makers that are worried about really going out there and advocating for making really big transmission investments in an environment where they're hearing from their constituents all the time that they have, that they're suffering with the cost of living and that, their energy bills have gone up so much. So I think if politicians had a sense that the general public was more on board with the idea that, okay, we get it, our energy system's old, we've got to invest in it to keep it going, like, let's make smart investments, I think policymakers would be more inclined to, be a little bit more supportive. So to me, I think, as I said actually at the beginning of my segment, I think the biggest gap that we've had from a convincing standpoint, and that's because it's been a gap in communications, has just been helping regular folks understand that, like, your bills are going up a lot. It's not because we're investing too much. It's because we're investing too little and we're investing in the wrong things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think Abby nailed it. I don't have anything to add. I think there are obviously we can talk about beyond education. There are barriers, I think, sometimes to building transmission, which we could get into. But in terms of who, like the education piece, I do think just generally people, it's not something that you think about. Power lines are around you throughout your like everyday life, but it just kind of fades into the background. So.
Definitely. And I think it's also relevant to tie into other concerns that consumers have, for example, related to data centers. That's another thing that a lot of consumers have concerns about, need a lot of education on. I think tying it to other stories that relate to the power sector. I mean, what story doesn't relate to the power sector? But that is really useful. When we talk to our state legislators, we have these public calls, but we also have state legislators only calls. A lot of them are concerned about the cost because of their constituents being concerned about their energy bills. And so at the end of the day, a lot of it is a public facing issue that works up the way to elected officials. But all right, question here that you answered in the Q&A, Zach, but I do want to just kind of elevate it. Given that the estimates of household savings are on average, what factors affect the amount of savings that households see on their utility bills? I just want to elevate that to the larger group because I do think it's a relevant question outside of just the typed answer.
Yeah, and we touched on this a little bit with one of the previous questions, but it does depend on whether you're in an RTO or not in an RTO. RTOs allow kind of broader power sharing than a smaller utility footprint, individual utility footprint might have. So there are some broad energy savings that accrue from that, along with greater reliability benefits. But then there are also just kind of individual policy choices that a state or public utility commission may make around specific programs that they're trying to promote, whether that's electrification, distributed energy resources, efficiency. All of these things are things that often are paid for on electric bills in some way, and do affect kind of what your total bill cost ends up being. And then, as I touched on, it also just depends on the availability and resource mix that you have in your state. Some states are going to have more abundant wind and solar, and so that will just inherently allow them to have lower costs.
All right, great. Thank you so much. We are coming up on the end here, so I'll ask a final question. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you all would want to make your draw attention to or really drive home, or something that we have touched on that you really want to drive home? Any closing remarks from you all on kind of this big topic of grid transmission investments and energy affordability?
Yeah, I mean, I have since you're giving me a soapbox, something that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since last week when there were a number of decisions made about transmission lines that will maybe not get built as a result. There's a lot of talk about the uncertainty with the federal environment and the risk that electricity generating projects from various different resources, that it's hard to know when or if those projects will come online because of, some of the federal policy stance and the way that it's frankly being weaponized against certain energy resources. And the reality is that that is true for every resource. So the moment that, decisions were made to target any type of energy resource and make that really a tool of the federal government to kind of go, maybe not act in good faith based on specific resource preferences. I mean, who's to say that the next administration isn't going to have a different set of priorities and preferences, and then 4 years later you get another set? And so some regulators, I think, are really grappling with how to contend with that environment when you're making decisions about projects that can take 10, 15, 20 years to build. And it has always been true that you are making decisions to build those projects on the belief that the generation will come online in 10, 15, 20 years, whenever that project is supposed to be ready. And there is a whole host of things that can happen in between that impact it. So I think that we need to find a better way to operate and continue to make investments in this environment of uncertainty, maybe with more off ramps or future decision points where you can, mitigate potential burden to ratepayers for something that might not materialize. But the solution can't just be to wait for certainty, because that certainty is not coming. It'll only ever be 3.5 years of certainty, and that's really not enough time to build much. So that is the thing that I just can't stop thinking about these days.
Turns out that's somewhat similar to what I was going to say, in terms of we can't wait for certainty. No, it's great. I think it's good to end on similar messages. We should have been building transmission 10 years ago to prepare for the new resource, the new wind and solar that we want to have online, and should have had online, and don't today. And I do think, part of that is we also can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We know that we need more transmission, and we know that it needs to be built quickly. As Abby said, it can take 10, 15, or 20 years to build a transmission line. And that's not the scale for, addressing decarbonization. So yeah, we can't necessarily wait around to make sure that we have the exact perfect plan, or that we have the no uncertainty at all. When you're talking about making decisions for 20 years in the future, it does take a little bit of triangulation, because none of us have crystal balls. So it's yeah, I think that's where I'll end. Is we should be. I've been building transmission tomorrow, so the next best time is to do it today. We should have been building transmission yesterday, but the next best time is today. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was a lot of information in just an hour, and thank you for being agile with responding to lots of those questions as well. We are going to be sending the recording and slides and like a recap article, just kind of outlining the talking points here, which will be emailed to you and posted on our website. We also have more on our website. We have some more transmission specific webinars and articles that you can look at as well. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Zach and Abby for being here. And have a great rest of your weeks. Take time to find rest in this crazy time. There are so many things that you feel like you need to be doing, but we can't take care of our communities if we don't take care of ourselves. So take some time, take some rest, and keep doing great work. I'll see you all in a future event. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Thank you.